Welcome, friends and foes, survivors and killers. Let's sit around the campfire together and talk about Dead by Daylight, specifically the killer for Resident Evil Project W, Albert Wesker, otherwise known as the Mastermind. Before I get going, I'm just going to come right out and say it. The second Resident Evil chapter absolutely kicks the arse of the first, and I have several reasons to believe that. The one thing the first RE chapter has going for it is the choice of characters. Having the main four leads of most of the games, alongside arguably this series' most iconic monster, who just received a modern glow-up in the RE3 remake, was always going to be a really difficult act to follow. And if you're the kind of person who just wants a licensed adaptation to have big names in it, Project W might not scratch that itch. Rebecca Chambers especially isn't what you'd call a poster girl of the franchise. Aside from being the player character in Resident Evil 0, her appearances have mostly been in supporting roles, or additional modes like RE5's Mercenaries mode. The two big names associated with the chapter are Ada Wong, Resident Evil's femme fatale and recurring anti-villain for the series, and Albert Wesker, a secondary villain who made his debut at the beginning of the series before he took main villain status in Resident Evil 5. I'll be covering Ada separately in her own video at some point. I'd like to begin by dedicating this video to the Matrix cosplayer himself, Albert Wesker. So let's jump right in. I'm going to take a shot in the dark here and guess that at least some people watching this video haven't played many of the Resident Evil games where Wesker is featured. So we're going to start off with a little biography for the guy before we look at how well he was adapted. Albert was part of Project W, a program by the CEO of the Umbrella Corporation, one Oswald Spencer, to genetically engineer humans with desirable physiological traits to create a race of superior human beings, a process known as eugenics. He was one of only two survivors of the program, the other being Alex, who had gone to be the villain of Resident Evil Revelations 2. Every child of the program was given the surname Wesker, and Albert would become an accomplished virologist, graduating from university at only 17, before working for Umbrella as he developed the T-Virus alongside Dr. William Birkin. The T-Virus was effectively Umbrella's key to creating bioweapons, and Wesker oversaw the initiation of the Tyrant Project, creating Umbrella's line of super soldiers, intelligent enough to follow orders, but not enough to start questioning them. Nemesis was one of the later products of the T-Virus, but Wesker started to find work elsewhere before the Tyrant Project's completion. Still on Umbrella's payroll, he worked first for the US Army and then for Raccoon City's Special Tactics and Rescue Service, STARS, where he made captain of the Alpha Team. Wesker would go on to betray his STARS colleagues during the Mansion incident, when he led Alpha Team into the Spencer Mansion in the Arcade Mountains. Umbrella were maintaining a lab under the mansion and some of their test subjects had escaped, spreading the virus to Umbrella staff and forcing STARS to investigate. Wesker was tasked with the cover-up. Umbrella wanted him to arrange the deaths of the other STARS members, to leave no witnesses, and to get the Tyrant embryos out of the facility. But Wesker planned to get the embryos to a rival company instead. Once his deception was uncovered, Albert would infect himself with a specialized strain of the T-Virus designed to enhance its physiology to superhuman levels. And despite failing to acquire the embryos or finish off STARS, Wesker escaped the mansion lab with his remaining STARS colleagues having no idea he was still alive. Now empowered by the T-Virus, Wesker had gone to be a thorn in Umbrella's side, masterminding the acquisition of Umbrella's notes and viral samples across the world. He employed Ada Wong to take samples of the G-Virus from Dr. Birkin in Resident Evil 2, and to acquire a dominant species Plaga parasite from Los Illuminados in Resident Evil 4. That doesn't mean he was afraid to get his hands dirty himself, though. He went after the T-Veronica virus from an Umbrella base in Antarctica during the events of Code Veronica, in which he displayed his T-Virus enhanced power for the first time since the Mansion incident. All of this was building up to Wesker making his big power play in Resident Evil 5, and his appearance in that game is the primary basis for his adaptation into Dead by Daylight. Wesker's plans that had been ticking over in the background of RE2, RE4 and Code Veronica came to fruition in his completion of Ouroboros, a bioweapons project designed to mass infect the entire world and kill off almost all of humanity, leaving only those with genetic quirks similar to his own that allowed them to survive the mutations and build a new humanity, of which Wesker envisioned himself as their messiah. After infecting himself and a handful of others with the Ouroboros virus, he would go on to be stopped by Chris Redfield and Sheva Alomar, who would throw his body into a volcano to ensure the T-Virus would not revive him again. A modified version of Ouroboros would go on to be used by Alex Wesker in RE Revelations 2, but Albert's story was, for all intents and purposes, over. Dead by Daylight actually gives Wesker much more lore than I expected that he'd get, at least more than Nemesis got, but it's mostly just retelling his personal backstory up to RE5. The entity picks up Wesker after his infection with Ouroboros before his final defeat, and depicts Wesker as his most physically powerful. It's important to note just how much Wesker's power level ratchets up as his mutation develops. In Code Veronica, he's fast and strong, capable of moving far faster and hitting harder than Chris and allowing him to easily outmatch Chris in hand-to-hand combat. But in RE5, this is taken to whole new extremes, as he dodges bullets so quickly it looks like he's teleporting, and is so strong he pushes a hole through Oliver Spencer's chest with just his flat outstretched fingers. This aspect of him is fulfilled pretty perfectly in Dead by Daylight, as he hurls himself around in pursuit of the survivors. I honestly didn't know how they'd be able to make Wesker's teleport-like powers in RE5 function in Dead by Daylight, but I think they've made it work pretty damn well. The implementation of the push and throw mechanics that allow Wesker to hurl the survivors around is a really nice touch, that reminds us that Wesker's abilities aren't supernatural like the Nurse's blinks or the Blight's rushes, but acts of raw physical strength. It's the one thing Wesker does that gives him a mechanically unique selling point that no other killer before him did in the same way that he does it, and that fans of RE5 can point at and say, this is Wesker. You see a character who dashes around so fast you can barely see him, and is so strong that he hurls grown men around like toys, and that's very clearly Wesker. It's a mechanical distinction that I'd argue Nemesis never had, because what made Nemesis memorable was his presence as a game function in Resident Evil 3, as opposed to being a whole character with a power set that could be easily transferred to Dead by Daylight. Nemesis in RE3 is the Pursuer, a living wall that runs at you to make you stay on your toes and keep moving. He's no more a full character than the boulder in Indiana Jones. In terms of what you can adapt in Dead by Daylight, you can't really adapt that identifying characteristic, so you have to go with secondary stuff, like a tentacle that he has. But that means the power he has isn't really very memorable. The resultant feeling is that Nemesis was compressed into Dead by Daylight. He had to leave his flamethrower, his rocket launcher, and his more radical mutations at the door, and come in with just his tentacle and two little undead buddies that make him feel like a miniaturized version of himself. Wesker doesn't have that problem, because he has something unique to him, very distinct to him, that developers adapted into Dead by Daylight with that uniqueness in mind. This made him work in a way that Nemesis never really could. The only part of Wesker's power that I'm not entirely sold on is the Ouroboros infection system, and just feels shoehorned in to give unnecessary complexity and make it feel like Resident Evil, I suppose. At least the Nemesis infection system makes sense for gameplay purposes because it allows tentacle use to be flexible and reactive without giving him a super oppressive 1v1 like Destiny used to have. The 3-hit chase system limits his lethality somewhat. But for Wesker, it just feels like the devs said, we want to add Ouroboros infection to the game, how do we do it? And just Control-C, Control-V Nemi's infection system over, with the crates and everything. Although I've got to admit I'm pretty happy to see first aid sprays appearing in Dead by Daylight, even if it is in a pretty irrelevant context. The one place I think Ouroboros is undoubtedly well used is his Mori. I'm a big fan of the shot as the survivor has their mouth agape as they die. It's a neat little reference to the fate of Excella in Resident Evil 5. But I think the thing that makes Wesker one of the most memorable licensed killers is his voice work. I'm pleased to report, first of all, that this isn't DC Douglas voicing the character, nor is any of the actors who've voiced Wesker prior like Richard Waugh or Peter Jessup. It's a new voice actor who actually does a really solid DC Douglas impression, but you can definitely tell it's not him. This Wesker's too, British, I want to say? He does a great job with the voice, so I wouldn't be surprised if this is the actor that Capcom goes with for the upcoming Resident Evil 4 remake and potential future appearances by Wesker in other RE titles, like potential remakes for Code Veronica or RE5. My issue with the voice lines is more the lines chosen themselves. Pretty much every single one is directly from Resident Evil 5, and while a lot of them do work really well, especially the ones that reflect his disdain for Chris, there's a couple that just feel like they were put in for RE5 fans to soy face at and are just weird out of context. Like the 7 minutes quote, as memorable as it is, makes absolutely no sense in DBD's context, and
tonight, I shall release Ouroboros.
Will you now, Jimmy? You don't have your missiles or Excella anymore. You're a blonde man with indoor sunglasses running around a bit of wood with Laurie Strode and Steve Harrington. Get some fucking perspective, man. Pinhead is a better implementation of the licensed voice line thing, in my opinion, because while the Hellraiser quotes are fun little Easter eggs for people who've watched the films, they're also placed in a context where they make sense. Like,
"You shall not escape me,"
is used when a survivor is picked up at the exit gates, for example, or
"I have such sights to show you,"
is saved for the Maury when he gives a particular survivor his undivided attention. Wesker's voice lines feel less, cultivated, I want to say. Like they were picked because people would remember them instead of picked because they fit. Part of that might also be RE5 having some of the weakest writing in the Resident Evil series, in my opinion, and Wesker being one of the casualties of that poor writing. Worth warning you here, I'm going to go on a bit of an aside about why I don't think Wesker was the right villain for that particular game, and if you don't want to hear it, there's a timestamp right now to skip past it and go straight to my final thoughts on Wesker's implementation into Dead by Daylight. Skip ahead now if you want to, and if not, strap in. It's going to be a bumpy ride. Resident Evil 5 handles the topic of eugenics, the pseudoscientific ideology of arranging human reproduction to breed certain characteristics, far more directly than any RE title prior. Albert and the other Wesker children are explicitly chosen by Oswald Spencer and the Project W staff because of desirable genetic traits, and Wesker proclaims to launch the Ouroboros missiles to reshape humanity into a more advanced and evolved race. This is an angle that Wesker's Dead by Daylight lore, limited as it is, plays into. His first thoughts upon arrival in the fog are that he's surrounded by, lesser beings that deserve to be put out of their misery. This, in isolation, is good stuff. Resident Evil is ultimately a game about eugenicists and the damage that they cause when given unlimited power and funds, and the villain of RE5 embodying that horrific ideology is a good way to tackle it head on. The problem I have when it comes to how that relates to Wesker's role in RE5 isn't the eugenics part, it's the ideology part. Because that's ultimately what eugenics is. It's an ideology driven by an obsession with purity. At first glance, one might confuse Albert Wesker for a true blue eugenicist from the start. He worked for Umbrella on the T-Virus project and displays great disdain for people who do not share his biological advantages. But it's important to remember in Wesker's case that this comes from his gigantic ego. Up until RE5, there's nothing to suggest that he takes the manifestation of eugenicist ideology seriously. Even in his first appearance in the series, he betrays Umbrella for a rival company that offers to pay him handsomely for the stolen research. Doesn't really sound like someone who believes in Umbrella's cause of genetic purity, does he? Throughout all his appearances, Wesker is defined by a purely pragmatic sense of rational self-interest driven by his massive ego. Whether he stands to benefit from something is the only thing that matters to him when deciding his next course of action. When Leon went after Osmond Sadler in Spain to foil his kidnapping of Ashley Graham, Wesker didn't give a shit whether Sadler succeeded in implanting the plug of parasites in Ashley or not, because his goal was simply to get a sample of the dominant series plugger from Krauser and Ada. Same goes for the events of Code Veronica. Wesker's only goal, aside from having a bit of a scrap with Chris, was getting a sample of T. Veronica. Whether Umbrella was foiled or not, didn't matter to him. Even in RE5 itself, he portrays Excella, who genuinely believes in the eugenicist ideologies Wesker is spouting throughout the game, because it is in his rational self-interest to do so.
Bert, you said we joined this world together. Oh, why?
I thought they were partners.
Wesker doesn't give a damn about anybody but himself.
I don't buy Wesker trying to save humanity like he claims at Resident Evil 5. Wesker's an egotist who doesn't care about what happens to anyone else. If humanity are simply underdeveloped cattle next to his greatness, surely that's good for him, because that means he's special and nobody else is, and it's in his rational self-interest for things to stay that way, to ensure nobody could wield power over him or stand up to his will in the future. RE5 gave us a villain who would do this though. A true blue eugenicist who fully believes in the cause of evolutionary purity and has devoted his life to it. A villain who is sadly killed off unceremoniously in a 30-second flashback cutscene. Oswald Spencer, the CEO of Umbrella. His entire motivation is progressing the world through his eugenicist practices and stamping Umbrella's logo on the human genome. The Ouroboros Project's stated goal of infecting the entire world with a virus that either evolves their physiology or kills them is something Spencer would absolutely do, and do believing it was the right thing to do. But Wesker has been built up for years as a major player in the future of Resident Evil, and like a 19-year-old virgin in bed with Scarlett Johansson, Capcom blew their load way too early on making Wesker the main villain of an RE game. They spent ages meticulously preparing for him to make his move, but they paid it off way too hastily. The manhunt for Spencer as Umbrella starts to fall apart should have been an entire game by itself. Until the Lost in Nightmares DLC for RE5, it's pretty much just a background event. And if Lost in Nightmares bulked out to a full game with Chris and Jill scouring the world in search of Oswald Spencer, it would have made Jill's apparent death at Wesker's hands much more painful because we'd have had an entire game building up to it, and would have given Wesker time to slowly develop into the villain he could become in a later game. Let Ouroboros be Oswald's pet project that he was working on as a failsafe should Umbrella start to fall apart and he require a nuclear option, and have Chris and Jill unwillingly have to go along with Wesker's plans to bring him in because they'd need his help to take Spencer down. In my opinion, it would make RE5 more satisfying to play, but it would also keep Wesker around for future RE titles, which is something that Capcom direly wanted to happen. Between the introduction of Jake Muller in Resident Evil 6 and Alex Wesker in RE Rev 2, they clearly wanted to inject some Wesker back into the franchise after his death in RE5, and honestly, I think that kind of ruined the franchise. It says a lot that Resident Evil was in a pretty bad spot during these times and only really got revitalised when RE7 soft rebooted the whole franchise a few years later. Fortunately, if you're a Wesker fan, you'll probably like the more cartoonish portrayal of him in RE5, and this angle is something DBD plays into completely. Look at his add-ons. The Egg and Chalice, for example, break from typical Dead by Daylight naming conventions to share the exact name and item description they have in RE5. His Mori when his shades get punched off only to just regrow out of nowhere. Even the flavour text on the loose crank is a little tongue-in-cheek and references the goofier direction RE was taking at the time of Wesker's dominance. Hell, when you infect everyone with Ouroboros at once, you get a score event called Global Saturation. Like, how is that not just kind of brilliant? Dead by Daylight's take on Wesker is almost too loyal to Resident Evil 5 for its own good, because at least in my opinion, RE5 mangled Wesker's character beyond recognition and turned him into a joke. I guess if you like Wesker like that, you're completely within your rights to prefer this version of Wesker, but frankly, I think it's a case of so bad it's good, where his devolution into a comic book villain ultimately does more harm than good. However, I have to give credit where it's due. This adaptation is incredibly faithful to what a lot of Wesker fans and RE5 enjoyers would want Wesker to be. And they're the people who need to be satisfied when a character that they really enjoy is added to Dead by Daylight. It's not behaviour's job to compromise what a character already is so that I like them, for example. And Wesker is about as far from compromised as you can get. I never really liked Wesker in the first place, so when you're adapting a character like that, it probably isn't me you should be trying to cater to. He's an incredibly faithful adaptation, truly like they brought out Wesker to life in Dead by Daylight, and my respect for what they've done here is immense. Full disclosure, I didn't think they'd be able to do it properly. I thought it would be too similar to Blight or Nurse and they'd give something a little more half measures, but every expectation that I had has been thoroughly superseded and I love it. I said this back in my Year 6 review and I stand by it now. Behaviour's licensed content in the last year or so has gone from strength to strength, and Project W continues the trend set by Pinhead and Sadako of truly exceptional licensed killers. And who knows? Maybe once Capcom notices the inevitable massive success of Project W and the previous RE chapter, we might finally get an RE chapter that I'll really be able to enjoy. Something a bit more, homely. Now I said my piece, I'd love to hear what you guys think. Are you pleased with how Wesker was adapted? Do you agree with my controversial takes on Resident Evil 5? Or do you think I'm just full of shit? Either way, I'd love to hear what you think in the comments because they always lead to some interesting discussions. I'm going away to visit family next week, so there may not be any content coming out next week, but I'll see if I can rig something up in the next couple of days to maybe tide us over during the week break. And even if I don't, the Jonah video is still like half done, so I'll do that as soon as I get back. In the meantime, make sure to subscribe if you haven't already, and you can check the link in the description to take a look at my Twitter, my Twitch, my Discord server, and my Patreon if you think my content is worth your money. Patrons get a day early access to my videos and some other sweet perks, so if you're the kind of person who's interested in that sort of thing, then do go take a look. Helps keep the channel afloat, which is, nice. While down there, you can take a look at the link for Wraith Energy to purchase your own sugar-free energy drinks without the crash. They're excellent long-term partners for the channel, and I cannot recommend them enough, so do go take a look and use code PICKLE20 for 20% off at checkout. That's all from me, and I'll see you when I see you. Till then, ta-ta for now.